Hello, and welcome to Beyond Biotech, the weekly podcast from Labiotech. I'm Dylan Kassane, and this is episode 172 for the podcast. Urinary tract infections, or UTIs, affect millions worldwide, driving sepsis, antibiotic overuse, and microbial resistance. Current diagnostics rely on either slow lab cultures or unreliable dipsticks, and often lead to delayed or even unnecessary treatment. Llusern's Lodestar DX changes that, a point-of-care test that detects 96% of key UTI pathogens in just 35 minutes, no lab required. In this episode, I'm joined by Emma Hayhurst, who shares her journey into diagnostics, Llusern's mission, and the emergence of Wales as a biotech hub with a growing life science sector fueling local innovation. We discuss UTI prevalence, diagnostic gaps, and how rapid, accurate testing can transform patient care and antimicrobial stewardship. Join us for a compelling look at redefining UTI management right after this message from our friends at Inside Biotech.
Are you curious about the people and breakthroughs shaping the future of biotechnology? Then you've got to check out Inside Biotech, hosted by me, Gabriella Rubert. Inside Biotech features monthly conversations with the scientists, entrepreneurs, and investors driving innovation in one of the fastest growing biotech hubs, Los Angeles. Recent episodes featured topics like drug repurposing for treatment of certain cancers, science-backed consumer wellness brands, and navigating career transitions outside of academic research. From cutting-edge science to real career stories, it's where science storytelling, big business, and professional development all intersect. Search Inside Biotech wherever you get your podcasts and hit follow today.
Emma, welcome to Beyond Biotech.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Emma, why don't you start by just introducing yourself and giving us just a little bit of an overview on your journey and how you ended up at Llusern Scientific.
Okay, so I'm Emma Hayhurst and I am a microbiologist by background. I actually very early on wanted to do something with zoology and animals and then got sidetracked by microbiology because I didn't realize what a cool subject it was. And then my lecturers convinced me and I changed to microbiology and never looked back. Did a PhD and postdoc up at the University of Sheffield and was kind of looking at bacterial cell walls and the dynamics and really fundamental questions about cell biology and cell division. And I remember being in this room in front of this microscope, trying to look at these cell walls that I'd exploded, trying to work out how it all fit together. And I was thinking, gosh, I could do this till I was 80. And actually in the real world, no one would ever really be impacted by it. And that doesn't mean it's not cool, but it means it's probably not for me. And that prompted a look really beyond what I was doing and a focus on more applied research. So to the University of South Wales back in 2000 as a lecturer, got a position there. And that was partly because I wanted to do applied research, and it was partly because I was really, I was 30. I knew that I wanted to have children. It was a permanent position, all those kinds of things that are going on in your mind. So moved there, had 2 children, didn't really do much with research for a while. And then I got a small amount of money just to kickstart my research in the area of antimicrobial resistance. And that was just after my second child was born. So I started looking at antimicrobial resistance, and through there led me to diagnostics. And we had this small amount of money to kickstart a project to try and develop an affordable diagnostic back in 2016. And that was the project that would eventually become Llusern, which was formed in 2020. So I found myself becoming CEO of a spin-out company, which was never the intention. I've kind of accidentally ended up here as the least reluctant person to do it, but I really love it. I'm in my right place.
Tell me a little bit more about how the company got started. What's the real mission?
So the mission is to really develop affordable diagnostics. I've always been interested in global health and inequalities in global health. I spent some time in my early 20s working in a clinic in rural Ghana, And I could see firsthand that you don't need the cleverest solutions. You need the ones that will work in quite challenging environments. And I felt like in academia in general, there was too much focused on being the cleverest and not enough focus on being the most useful. So it was always in my head around health and um, really antimicrobial resistance is a massive part of that. And the whole premise for the company started when we got some seed funding from the Longitude Prize, which was a Nesta-funded challenge to develop an affordable diagnostic that could tackle antimicrobial resistance. So that set everything for the company from the very start. It needed to be, that was the mission, and it is still the mission. That's how it began, really.
And these diagnostics that you're working on, you're focusing specifically on urinary tract infections?
We are in the first instance. What we've developed is a molecular diagnostic testing platform. So the way that it works, it can be applied to pretty much any infectious disease and many non-infectious diseases. It's a platform. And the idea is then you develop tests that will work on the platform. And the reason that we focused initially on urinary tract infections is just because we felt that no one else was, and it felt like a real neglected disease. And the more, I'm not a clinician, I wasn't an expert in urinary tract infections, but the more we spoke to people, the more we realized that you've got this incredibly common bacterial infection. There's over 400 million cases globally every year. 90% of sufferers are female. Some people go on to have decades of really horrendous pain and complications. And yet no one seemed to be treating it as important. And there were no good diagnostic tests. And that meant that you had this huge amount of overdiagnosis. And that obviously millions of unnecessary antibiotic prescriptions, which is really bad for the patients themselves because their microbiome gets decimated, but it's also obviously fuels the spread of antimicrobial resistance. But then the opposite problem is also true. You have loads of missed infections, and that means people ending up with chronic UTI, and it means people ending up in hospital. So we just felt it was a neglected area, and we wanted to start there, really.
It was a spin out from the University of South Wales, and you're still working with them. Can you tell me a little bit about how this collaboration works between a university and a company?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, I think, because yes, we do. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the university to continue to work with them. Obviously, there's some really key collaborations that we could work on, not just on the specific research that we're carrying out, but on the wider picture. They have business students, they have marketing students, they have people work on sustainable supply chains, all these kind of wider business questions that we could really work with. So we're getting the benefit of their expertise, and they're getting the benefit of students working with companies and that link to industry. And obviously that we can bring employability benefits there. Having said that, it's not been an entirely smooth ride. And I think that's sadly often the case with spin-outs from universities, where the different priorities mean that there can be misunderstandings. And so we've kind of had some ups and downs, but I'm really hopeful that the future is bright. And I really believe, as an ex-academic myself, I really see the value that academics institutions can bring. If only we could get over the tension between what investors want to see, what spin-outs need, and what the university thinks it wants as well.
Tell me a little bit about working in Wales. We wrote about Wales at Labiotech a little bit earlier this year, some of the great companies that are there. It has a really fast growing life science ecosystem. What are the strengths that you see there, and what are some of the opportunities that are still emerging?
Yeah, I think Wales is a great place to be as a life sciences company at the moment. I think we're small enough to feel really connected, and that's huge. There's so many networking events where you basically get a lot of the emerging companies and the more established companies and the NHS and academia and government and the wider industry. So you can really find exactly who you need to find for whatever question that you have. And you also build collaborations really nicely that way. We work closely with Public Health Wales. We work closely with at least two of the health boards in Wales, plus the universities. And I think also just having that connection with other companies in a similar space to share challenges, to share experiences, to share resources, really. So that's all really exciting, and it feels like it's becoming even more of a focus at the moment. So it feels like a really exciting place to be. I think we also have access to excellent graduates because you've got all of the universities in Wales, and for example, our production scientist, he is a University of South Wales student who did a placement with us, and then we thought, oh, we've got to keep him. And so he got a job when he graduated straight out of university, and he's been with us for nearly 2 years now. And that's been brilliant for us because he's the perfect fit and hopefully pretty good for him as well. So it's an exciting place to be, definitely.
So lots of good things about Wales. Are there any challenges that you find just being a little bit outside of that London, Oxford, Cambridge area?
Well, to be honest, we can get a train into London from 2 hours in 2 hours. So I don't feel like we're that outside it, but I think that the perception is still there. So I almost think it's like a perception thing. I think we still have this conceived idea that things from the Golden Triangle, oh, they're at an advantage, they'll find it easier. And I don't actually think that's true, but I think the challenge comes from breaking that down and from saying, no, 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 hang on a minute. Wales is really strong in this as well. And that'll just take time and investment. And I'm sure that will change as we build even more, put even more resources into this space. I think the other challenge is just around lab space, actually. We're at Cardiff Edge Business Park, which is it's managed by Pioneer Group, and they've built really cool innovation parks around the UK. And their vision for the site is brilliant, but it's not there yet. We're buying into their vision, and they're buying into our vision. And I think for companies like us, we had to invest quite a chunk of our initial investment into building our own lab facilities. So it would have been lovely to have had a space that we could have moved into, developed, kept the money in the company, and then moved on when we were ready.
Let's talk a little bit about the work that you're doing in UTIs. For people who aren't really familiar, can you maybe explain what a UTI is and why they're so common?
So a UTI is a urinary tract infection, and that just means it's an infection by a pathogen, usually a bacteria, but you can also get viruses and fungus of the urinary tract, and that can be anything from the urethra, the bladder, the ureters, and then the kidney. So you get lower and upper UTI depending on where the infection is localized. They're incredibly common, well, for many reasons. I think just because you can easily pick up contaminants which come across from the vaginal microbiome or from the gut microbiome and become embedded into the bladder. So, and once in there, they can establish themselves and then cause all sorts of issues for the patients who have them. I think they've largely been, because they haven't been a real focus. They're not as people don't care about them in the same way that they care about, for example, cancer or sepsis, or you've got these kind of these really I don't know, you tend to get a lot of resources and a lot of focus into these certain infection areas, but actually UTIs they can go on to cause sepsis. They're a leading cause of sepsis. It's about 30% of sepsis cases are preceded by a UTI. So they can, and in England alone, there was nearly 200,000 people were hospitalized following a UTI in 2024. So particularly as you get older, they can have really severe consequences. And yet they're so complicated. There's loads of different patient groups within UTI. It's all labeled as UTI, but actually there's lots of different patient groups, lots of different clinical settings, loads of different pathogens that can cause UTIs. And urine is a really messy sample as well. We now know that it's not sterile. It's got its own microbiome in the bladder. So it's not like blood. If you take a blood sample and there's a bacteria in it, you're pretty confident that that bacteria shouldn't be there and is causing an infection. Whereas with urine, it's full of bacteria anyway. So determining exactly what's causing the infection it is a real challenge.
What about in terms of prevalence? You mentioned 200,000 cases that make it to hospital, but in terms of prevalence in the UK or globally, how many cases would we be talking about?
So the latest data is 400 million cases globally every year. So it is the most common bacterial infection of adults and the second most common bacterial infection generally behind respiratory infections. They reckon it cost the NHS in England in 2024 £600 million for the year because of issues with UTI. And they're a really common reason for someone to prescribe an antibiotic, particularly in community settings. It's about 6 or 7 million prescriptions every year for UTI. So that gives an indication of the scale. Up to 50% of women will have one over the course of their lifetime. And once you've had an initial UTI, it's up to a third of women will go on to have recurrent infections. And nobody really understands why.
And so is it something that affects women more than men, and are there other demographics that suffer more from UTIs?
Absolutely. So it's women are 90% of UTI sufferers. So it's it's very much a women's health issue. Uh, Women are at higher risk as they go through perimenopause and menopause. They have changing conditions within their vaginal microbiome, which can impact on the risk for UTI. But they're also really common in diabetic patients. There's a more increased risk of a UTI if you're diabetic, and they increase with age. So then it becomes more common in men as well. So as you go up in through the age brackets, then the prevalence kind of evens out between men and women. And obviously, we've got an aging population, so UTI prevalence is actually increasing. It's going up by about 10% every year, and that's probably because we've got an aging population. So it's just becoming more and more common.
Now, you said that there's a pretty clear link to sepsis, or there can be a clear link to sepsis. Antibiotic resistance as well is a consequence of all of this antibiotic prescribing. Are there other health problems that are associated with UTIs?
Well, there's a couple of yes, there are. The major one is chronic or recurrent UTI, which is, as I said, it's this subset of women that go on to have, sometimes multiple infections every year, and that can go on for decades. Um, and up until recently, there wasn't even a definition for what a chronic UTI is. Often these women, because they are almost entirely women, there are some men that also suffer from chronic or recurrent UTI, but it's mostly women. And they often have negative results in the existing diagnostic tests, so they're almost dismissed, and then there's nowhere for them to go. And there's only a few specialist clinics that will be able to offer treatment, diagnostic and treatment pathways for these women, and they're just way oversubscribed. There's way more women. People think up to 2 million in the UK alone, and just not enough space for them to be treated. So they feel like they've got nowhere to go. They're dismissed by the system. And the thought is that what happens there is, for whatever reason, the bacteria that cause the acute infection become embedded in the bladder lining, or they could cause biofilms, and then they're just not detectable, and they sit there, and then they kind of flare up. So people get these ongoing flares, and really there is not enough understood about why certain women get that, whereas others it's self-limiting and they get better. I think that's a major one that a major issue with acute UTI, and that's why we need to improve acute UTI so that we can prevent people from becoming chronic. If we can diagnose and treat better in the first place, then we'll stop people going down that chronic pathway.
Let's talk about that diagnosis then. What's the main issue or the main problem with the gold standard for UTI diagnosis today, something like a lab culture test?
So the first issue is that it takes too long to return a result. So obviously, if you're doing a lab culture, you're growing the bacteria in the urine. That means you have to transport the sample to a lab. It means you have to wait overnight or longer for the bacteria to grow, and then you have to transmit the result back to the clinician, by which time, 90% of the time, the patient has already been treated, just by guesswork, really. So there's that time delay between when you need it and when the results come. That's massive, and it's been recognized by NICE as a real health need to make UTI testing quicker. and bring it to point of care. And then the other issue is just that we're using testing that is 50 years out of date. It's based on a dodgy bit of work that was done in the 50s. It uses arbitrary cutoffs for the bacteria in the urine. It looks for quite a small range of bacteria. It is biased towards some of the quick growing bacteria like E. coli. It won't pick up bacteria that are growing in biofilm because they tend to come out of the biofilm in a dormant state. And so you put them on a plate and they won't grow. You have to use enhanced methods to make them grow. And then finally, it's a third of all those culture results that come back as mixed growth, which means that no clinical result is returned. It's entirely useless. It's such an inefficient use of NHS resources. All of those urines, thousands of them. In Cardiff, in 1 year, there was 80,000 urines processed by one lab, and a third of them are coming back as mixed growth, suspect contamination, but there's a growing amount of evidence now that that is not contamination, that's polymicrobial infection. And that's really important that we detect and treat those properly. And yet lab culture just isn't set up to do that, not in its current format.
I think that was something you linked to on your website there. There were 33% of cultured urine samples came back with a positive result, yet we just gave them antibiotics anyway. That's a downside in terms of overprescription, in terms of cost. But what does that mean for antimicrobial resistance?
Well, obviously, one of the biggest ways that we can tackle antimicrobial resistance is to diagnose and treat more appropriately. So you're exactly right. You've got this big disconnect between the treatment decision and the actual diagnostic result. And that means that you get all these unnecessary or inappropriate antibiotics being prescribed. And that is going to create the environment for resistant bacteria to thrive, because you're adding a selection pressure. You're giving the antibiotics so the resistant ones will then thrive. And it means that if that infection, it's more likely then that that patient will have a resistant infection in the future because they've had that course of antibiotics.
I guess if we're talking diagnostics, there's this delay in diagnostics because it can take time to actually get the sample assessed and then the results back to the doctor and the therapy prescribed. But are there actually shortcomings in the therapies that are prescribed themselves? Is there a lack of good therapies once we find out what's going on?
Yeah, completely. So at the moment, we're relying mostly on antibiotics because there isn't really much other option. But people tend to prescribe the first line, which is nitrofurantoin. But for some of the main bacteria that cause UTI, nitrofurantoin is completely inappropriate. So it means you're giving an antibiotic that it might be that there's an infection there, but it's the wrong drug for the wrong bug. And that, of course, it's not only about the fueling of resistance, it's also the impact on that person's microbiome. Because if you're giving an antibiotic, obviously you're going to decimate the microbiome, and that means that you're going to cause dysbiosis. It means that you're going to have potentially a pathogen can really establish itself and cause more chronic complications. So that's the issue, is that we blindly give, if you look at the guidance for UTI prescribing, then we blindly give one or two antibiotics usually, and they're not the right ones for a lot of the bugs that are causing UTI. And then on top of that, there's not much else. There's a couple of vaccines that are they're not licensed in the UK yet, but you can get them privately, that show some promising results. And then there's various kind of physical methods where people instill things into the bladder. And there are various kind of more natural methods that are being investigated, but there's nothing that is standardly used for UTI. And again, I think it's a real need that we need to look at the way that we treat these conditions and improve them. There is a new antibiotic that's come out for UTI, but I don't think it will be suitable in all cases. But it's the first one in decades, and we just need more. We need more things to come. So people need to have more options so that they don't feel like they've got nowhere to go.
Well, they need more options, but they also need a faster test. And I guess that's why we want to talk to you today, because the tech that you've developed there at Llusern Can you walk me through how it works? It's called Lodestar DX. What does it do and how quickly does it do it?
So it uses molecular technology. It is a small analyzer. So it's a test system that consists of a small analyzer, which is Lodestar, and then you buy single-use test panels to place into the analyzer, one per patient. And the analyzer itself is a molecular test reader. So what it's doing is it's holding the reaction at the right conditions, the right temperature, and when you add urine to the test kit has got all the reaction components needed to carry out the molecular reaction. The molecular reaction uses a technology called LAMP, which is a bit like PCR. And everyone knew during COVID in the pandemic, you knew that if you really wanted to know if you had COVID, you did a PCR test. You didn't do one of those lateral flow at home because the PCR is the gold standard and it's highly accurate. And LAMP is the same. It has that same molecular accuracy, but there are a number of differences between LAMP and PCR. It's generally a more robust reaction, it's quicker, and it happens at one temperature. So what we developed was an analyzer that can run the LAMP reaction, and that's Lodestar. So it takes readings every 10 seconds. It holds the reaction at 65 degrees, and it's just looking for an increase in fluorescence that's associated with the presence of a particular piece of DNA. And that DNA is in, obviously, the pathogens. So the test kit has got 6 bacterial targets that are the 6 most common pathogens that cause UTI. In total, they cause about 93 to 95% of all UTI. So we're getting the major pathogens there. It takes reading every 10 seconds. It's looking for this increase in detection in fluorescence, and then it converts that raw reaction data into a positive or negative result using an internal algorithm. And the reason that we made it like that is we wanted to basically remove the barriers for using molecular technology, because it traditionally tends to be carried out in a lab. You tend to need to do an extraction of the sample so that you get the DNA out, and you tend to need to interpret a reaction curve. Whereas we want this to be used by anyone, by community nurses, by people working in care homes, by someone in a GP clinic. And that means we needed to make it really simple to use, no user interpretation, and no sample processing. So you can have a urine, you take less than 2 minutes to put the urine into Lodestar, and then Lodestar takes 35 minutes to return a positive or negative result for each of those 6 pathogens.
Is that what makes it really different to the traditional way? It's very user-friendly and it's just so fast?
Yeah, I think the speed of it is a major thing. I think also the fact that we can detect more difficult to grow bacteria as well. And I think as we understand more and more about UTI and about biofilm formation and about the fact that culture isn't always great at diagnosing what's there, then we're realizing that tests like ours, which don't rely on growth, mean that actually we can get more accurate diagnosis of UTI. And we're finding that at the moment it's being used in a private urology clinic, and they're finding that it's actually got a much better rate of detection for bacteria in the urine than culture. And that's because it can detect bacteria even if they can't grow. You can still detect them using Lodestar, and that's really important, particularly for complicated UTI or chronic UTI where you have these embedded infections.
So is the goal to really make it a point of care test? It's not going to be something where you're sending things off to labs and dealing with hundreds of thousands of samples every year?
No, Lodestar is designed purely for point of care. And I mean, it can even be run in the back of a car. So it truly can be in community settings. And that was always the intention, so that we can tackle that that dis that mismatch between the treatment decision and the time to the diagnostic results. Those things need to come together, because I think the other issue with diagnosing in a lab is that you're making the diagnostic decision without the patient in front of you. And I think the context of the patient and the patient's voice is really important. So I feel like with point of care testing, you're bringing the patient into the equation as well. So the clinician can make a decision based on the patient, based on the symptoms, and based on the evidence of a diagnostic test. I think that's really important.
So, where is Lodestar in terms of approval and validation? Are you just trying to progress in the UK or in Europe, North America as well?
We have got UKCA marking, which means we're on the market in the UK and we've got our first commercial sales. We have a couple of evaluations being set up within the NHS, but at the moment our sales are coming into private settings. We want to expand beyond the UK, and we've had interest from various other countries. One of the big challenges there is we need CE marking, which is it's it's the European Union regulatory stamp of approval, but there's a really long queue at the moment to get through that process, and it's quite expensive. So it's quite difficult for a startup to go through that process, but we are in the queue. So we're hopeful that we should get that within the next 12 months and be able to expand into other markets, Europe and beyond. The US, again, that would be amazing. They diagnose urine UTI quite differently in the US. They tend to use these big lab-based panels, so they're quite used to molecular testing. But again, it all happens in a lab, and they don't really have anything at point of care. So I think we could make a real difference there as well. But again, that comes down to funding to get regulatory approval and to break into the US market is quite a beast. And that is in the plans, but at the moment we're just road mapping what that might look like so that we can get some costs associated with it.
Well, I mean, to me, hearing about it, it seems like you're taking a big step forward in terms of speed, and also bringing diagnosis very close to the point of care. What about when it comes to prescriptions of antibiotics? Have you got a metric there that you're addressing, that therapy side, where you're looking to or hoping that fewer antibiotics are going to be prescribed and there's going to be less microbial resistance?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We don't have that information yet. Again, we've got a case study with our private practice, and also we're working on an evaluation with a national care home chain. And we're finding there in our case study that people are changing their treatment decisions, and particularly with the care home, it's giving the care assistants that are working in the home confidence to look for other reasons for the symptoms that they see in people, because the problem in older adults is the symptoms can be very vague. So there might be kind of non-specific deterioration, and our test is allowing people to say, well, okay, it doesn't look like there's a UTI, so let's look for other symptoms. Let's see if they're dehydrated, for example. So we're getting anecdotal evidence, but that's certainly not enough to make a claim. The ultimate would be to prove via a clinical trial that we do impact on antibiotic prescriptions. And to me, it's not really a reduction in antibiotic prescriptions as much as it's a improvement. Like, we need to give antibiotics if they're needed. So I would certainly, any clinical trial we do, I'd want to focus on patient outcomes first and foremost, because if you reduce antibiotic prescriptions, but you don't follow the patient, who's to say that in 6 months' time, that patient is on 18 months of prophylactic antibiotics because they've got an embedded infection? So that would be my ultimate, is to show that patient outcomes are improved by the use of our test. And I know that if that happens, prescriptions will also reduce and they will become more tailored and more appropriate.
Is Lodestar something that can be expanded out to other infections, other parts of the body?
Yeah, absolutely. We have plans. I mean, to be honest, even within UTI, there are other things we can do. We've got in development a panel for rarer pathogens, that long tail, where the bugs just show up 1 in 1,000 infections, but they're still important. You still need to know they're there. So we're working on the development of a test for rarer pathogens. And we're also working on one that we've got really promising early clinical data on, one that shows, that looks for host biomarker of infection. So that's really exciting, because then you could have bacterial ID and the host response in one test. And of course, we can add resistance gene detection in as well. So I think there's a whole lot more we can do within UTI, but we are also looking beyond UTI. One thing we get asked a lot about is whether it can do sexually transmitted infections as well, because the symptoms can be very similar. So in primary care, it would be really useful for clinicians to say, well, could it be UTI or could it be an STI? So that's something we're looking into. We're also in talks, and have been for a long time, with a big animal health company for using the test in dairy cattle to detect mastitis. So a completely different application, but using the same technology, similar pathogens, similar expertise. And the idea there would be we would develop it, but they would take it to market. So it would be an arm's length relationship for us, but it'd be great because it would be Lodestar getting into a whole new setting. And then beyond that, I've always had this real vision of using it in truly low resource settings. So I'd love to see it being used in, for example, in similar places to where I worked in Ghana, in very rural clinics, where it could be used as a more general diagnostic tool for, respiratory infections, UTI, STIs, whatever it was needed for. We can develop tests that will detect those.
A couple of final questions, Emma. Firstly, in terms of the bigger picture, what should we be looking for in the next 12 months? What are you hoping to see? What am I going to be reading about Llusern in the next 12 months?
Well, it'd be great if you could read that we've successfully closed our investment round, and we can move on to the next chapter of our journey. And that will really be, I think the next 12 months is pivotal for us. I think a lot of diagnostic companies struggle to show that they can have impact on patients, and we're already showing that we can. And I think that's really exciting. So to me, the next 12 months is building that evidence to show that Lodestar, we've got the diagnostic accuracy, we know that it works, but now it's about what impact can we have with that? How can we impact on treatment decisions? How can we improve antibiotic stewardship? And I don't know that we'll have all the answers in the next 12 months, but I think we'll be a long way along that journey. I think the other thing that we're doing at the moment is really finding those niche settings where Lodestar is going to make a real difference. And it's not necessarily where we would have predicted when we first started this journey back in 2020. One of the use cases at the moment is looking at it pre-operations. When you're doing quite an invasive urology operation, it's really important that you don't have bacteria in the urine, because that can increase the risk of post-op infection. So we've just started to work in that area, and we're getting some really promising data. And I'd love to have a real clear understanding of these are our 3 or 4 key pathways that we can impact using Lodestar, and this is the evidence that it can improve patient journeys. And this is the next step for us, is hopefully 1 or 2 successful NHS evaluations and looking on towards larger scale NHS adoption. That would be great.
Emma, if people want to learn a little bit more about what you're doing at Llusern Scientific, where can they go to stay updated?
I think the best thing is just on LinkedIn. If people are on LinkedIn, they can follow us there, where we make regular updates with what's going on. But that also feeds through to our website, which is www.llusern.co.uk with 2 L's. So if people want to just keep an eye on the website as well, then you can follow us on there. Or if anyone's got any specific things, then please do give us a shout. We've got a contact form on the website, and we're always happy to chat to people who are interested in what we're doing and who might have ideas or want to share experiences. So,
Emma, that's fantastic. We'll drop the link to Llusern into the show notes. Thanks for joining us today on Beyond Biotech.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out all the latest news and analysis at Labiotech.eu. I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.